Relax, she is just a white waitress. Preston Caldwell said it with a laugh, and the people around him laughed because men like him rarely laughed alone. The upper deck of the Silver Meridian glowed under warm gold lights, floating 3 miles off the Rhode Island coast like a palace that had forgotten the ocean could speak. Champagne moved from hand to hand. A jazz trio played near the stern. Investors in tailored suits smiled toward cameras while the black water rolled quietly beneath the glass railings. Preston stood at the center of it all in an ivory blazer, silver-brown hair brushed back, Swiss watch catching the light each time he lifted his glass. He was 46, powerful, polished, and certain that every meaningful voice on his yacht belonged to someone wearing a title. Grace Miller stood near the bar with a silver tray balanced against her hip. She was 29, white, fair-skinned, with calm blue eyes and brown hair tied back by a wine-red ribbon. Her white blouse was neat, her black apron plain, her expression quiet enough for people to mistake it for emptiness. A moment earlier, she had stepped toward Preston to mention the sound coming from below the deck. Not loud, not dramatic, just 3 faint metallic knocks beneath the music, followed by a thin hiss that reminded her of pressure escaping where pressure should not be. Preston had not let her finish. He had smiled at Derek Vance, his investment partner, and turned her warning into entertainment. Just a waitress. The words touched the room and made her smaller in everyone else's eyes. Grace did not lower her gaze. She did not argue. Her fingers tightened once around the tray, then relaxed. She had learned long ago that pride was often deafest when corrected in public. So she listened again. The music slid through the air. Ice clicked in glasses. The yacht shifted gently under expensive shoes. Then it came back. 3 knocks. A pause. One thin breath of sound beneath the floorboards, almost hidden under the bass line. Grace turned her head slightly toward the service corridor. Near the closed technical door, a dark crescent of seawater glistened where the teak should have been dry. Too small for guests to notice. Too wrong for her to ignore. Derek Vance leaned closer to Preston, still smiling. We should keep moving. The signatures need to happen before midnight. Preston nodded, already reaching for the folder on the cocktail table. Of course. Grace looked at the folder, then at the wet mark, then at the musicians. Stop the music, she said. No one moved. Preston's smile disappeared. Excuse me. Grace set the silver tray down on the bar without a sound. Please stop the music for 10 seconds. A few guests turned, offended by the calmness more than the request. Derek laughed softly. This is becoming a habit. Grace looked directly at Preston. Sir, your yacht is telling the truth your people are hiding. The sentence took the smile from every face nearby. Preston stepped toward her, anger rising behind his controlled eyes. You are on my vessel. Grace nodded. Yes, sir. That is why you should listen before it has to speak louder. Preston Caldwell stared at Grace as if the yacht itself had made a rude remark through her mouth. Around them, the upper deck held its breath in expensive silence. The jazz trio kept playing for 2 more uncertain notes. Then the pianist saw Preston's raised hand and stopped. The violin faded. The last brush of the snare drum dissolved into the night. For the first time since the Silver Meridian left Newport Harbor, there was no music between the guests and the ocean. At first, nothing happened. A woman near the railing gave a small, relieved laugh, ready to prove the waitress wrong. Derek Vance smiled as though the entire interruption had become useful evidence against her. Preston turned slightly toward Grace, his expression saying what his voice had not yet said. Satisfied? Then the sound came again. 3 knocks beneath the deck. Hollow. Metallic. Too even to be random. A pause. Then a narrow hiss, so thin it almost vanished inside the wind. No one laughed this time. Grace did not look triumphant. She looked toward the service corridor, where the faint crescent of seawater still shone under the gold lights. There, she said. Port side service access, below this deck. Preston's jaw tightened. Captain. The captain stepped forward from near the bridge stairs, his face suddenly alert. I heard it, sir. Derek's smile thinned. A loose fitting. Boats make noise. We do not need to turn a celebration into a maintenance seminar. Grace turned to him. Loose fittings do not leave salt water on interior teak. The words were simple. That made them difficult to dismiss. Preston followed her gaze to the floor. The mark was small, no wider than a bracelet, but once seen, it changed the room. The event manager hurried over with a towel, but Grace stepped between her and the water. "Do not wipe it." The manager froze, offended and frightened at once. Preston noticed the fear, not of water, of being caught managing truth. "Who reported this before?" he asked. The event manager opened her mouth. Derek answered first. No one reported anything meaningful. Grace looked at Preston. 2 technicians were arguing in the service corridor 15 minutes ago. One said the seal was not holding. The other said the report waits until after signatures. A low murmur moved through the guests. Derek gave a polished sigh. She overheard fragments while carrying shrimp cocktails. Grace's fingers brushed the edge of the bar, steadying herself. "Yes," she said. "People say honest things around service staff because they assume we cannot do anything with them." That sentence landed differently than the first. Less like a warning, more like a record of the room. Preston looked from Grace to Derek, then to the closed contract folder waiting on the table. For months, Derek had pushed this fleet expansion as the deal that would make Silver Meridian Holdings untouchable. Tonight was supposed to be clean. Cameras, signatures, a yacht gleaming under stars. No hesitation. No questions from a waitress in a black apron. The captain lifted his radio. "Engineering to port service access. Immediate inspection. Bring moisture meter and pressure gauge." Derek stepped closer. "Preston, be careful. If you delay now, the board will ask why you let an unqualified server interrupt a closed deal." Preston's eyes moved back to Grace. Her wine-red ribbon had loosened slightly in the wind. Her face remained calm, but he could see the cost of standing there while rich strangers measured her worth. He remembered his own words. Just a white waitress. They sounded smaller now. Smaller than the Knox. Smaller than the water. "Miss Miller," he said, using her name from the tag he had ignored all evening. "How did you know the sound came from there?" Grace looked toward the dark corridor. "Because my father repaired boats in Newport for 30 years, she said. "And he taught me that when a yacht whispers, you do not raise the music. You find out why." The captain's order moved through the Silver Meridian faster than the conversation on deck. Crew radios crackled. 2 engineers disappeared down the port service stairs with tool bags swinging at their sides. Guests drifted away from the wet mark as if distance could protect them from implication. Preston Caldwell stood near the bar, one hand resting beside the closed contract folder, his ivory blazer glowing under lights that suddenly felt too bright. He was used to silence following his decisions. This silence was different. It waited to see whether he would protect the truth or protect his pride. Grace Miller remained beside the service corridor, no longer holding the tray, no longer pretending to be part of the background. Her eyes stayed on the floor, on the small crescent of salt water that had changed the air around them. Derek Vance watched her with a thin smile, the kind men use when they are not worried yet, but want everyone to believe they are. "Preston," he said, lowering his voice, "we both know how this works. A preliminary maintenance note becomes a negotiation weapon. Someone finds a small leak, inflates the cost, delays closing, and suddenly your expansion price changes by morning. This is why we plan signatures tonight." Preston looked at him slowly. "You plan signatures tonight before the technical review." Derek's smile did not move, but something behind it tightened. "Because hesitation kills deals." Grace heard the words and thought of her father's shop in Newport. She could almost smell the oil, cedar, coffee, and rainwater that lived in the floorboards. Men in expensive jackets used to walk in with boats they loved in photographs, but ignored in maintenance. Her father would tap a hull with 2 fingers, close his eyes, and listen, not to impress anyone, to understand what the water had been trying to say. Once, when Grace was 12, she asked how he knew where the problem was before opening anything. He told her, "A boat tells the truth twice. First quietly, then expensively." She had never forgotten it. The engineering radio clicked. "Bridge, this is Lawson at Port Service Access. We have moisture inside the lower threshold. Checking seal now." Preston's face sharpened. The captain stepped closer to the radio. "Continue." A pause followed. Not long. Long enough for Derek to glance once toward his assistant near the champagne station. Grace saw it. Preston saw Grace see it. "There is something else," she said. Derek sighed. "Of course there is." Grace did not look at him. She looked at Preston. The maintenance report was not missing because of filing. Someone moved it. The event manager shifted near the floral wall. Her hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. Preston turned to her. Is that true? She hesitated. The entire deck seemed to lean toward her answer. I was told to hold the folder until after the signing, she said at last. By whom? Preston asked. The event manager looked at Derek's assistant. The assistant looked at Derek. Derek laughed once, quietly, without humor. This is ridiculous. We are talking about document timing, not sabotage. Grace's voice was calm. No one said sabotage. She let the word remain in the air because Derek had placed it there himself. The radio crackled again. Captain, the portside watertight door seal is compromised. Not catastrophic at dock speed, but this vessel should not proceed farther offshore until repaired. Stabilizer readings also show irregular load compensation. The captain closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them with command returning to his face. Understood. Maintain current position. No increase in speed. The guests murmured. Someone whispered that the deal was over. Someone else asked whether they should call the press team. Preston did not answer them. He was looking at the floor now, not at the water, not at the contract, not at Derek. At the floor. At the place Grace had pointed to before anyone with a title believed her. Miss Miller, he said, and his voice was quieter than before. What made you ask for the music to stop? Grace touched the edge of her wine-red ribbon, then lowered her hand. Because people use noise to avoid hearing what cost them. Preston looked up. The sentence found him cleanly. Around him, every expensive light on the yacht kept shining, but the room beneath it had changed. The waitress he had tried to shrink with one careless word had made the whole vessel speak. Preston Caldwell had heard warnings before, but never like this. Not from beneath his own feet. Not through a room full of people suddenly afraid to breathe. The Silver Meridian floated in the dark water, 3 miles from the Rhode Island coast, no longer feeling like a private kingdom, but like a machine with a secret finally forcing itself into the open. The captain ordered the yacht to hold position while engineers continued their inspection. The jazz trio stood silent near the stern, instruments lowered. The investors who had come to watch Preston sign a triumph now watched him study a crescent of saltwater on the teak floor. Grace Miller stood a few steps away, her black apron still tied neatly, her wine-red ribbon moving slightly in the wind from the open deck. Derek Vance crossed his arms. A seal issue does not destroy a business partnership, he said. And a service employee should not be treated like a maritime authority because she guessed correctly once. Preston turned toward him, but Grace spoke first. I did not guess. Derek's smile sharpened. Then what would you call it? Grace looked past him toward the technical stairs. Listening. The word was too plain to decorate, too steady to mock. The radio crackled again before Derek could answer. Captain, we found the maintenance log discrepancy. The digital record shows a warning entered at 6:40 this evening. It was marked pending review, then removed from the executive packet at 7:12. Preston's eyes moved to the event manager. Her face had gone pale under the deck lights. Who removed it, he asked. She looked down. I was told the packet needed to stay clean for the signing. By whom? Mr. Vance's assistant said the board would revisit pricing if the report appeared before signatures. Derek stepped forward. That is not what happened. The captain's voice cut through the denial, calm but firm. Security can pull corridor footage. Preston did not hesitate this time. Do it. Something changed in Grace's face then. Not surprise. Recognition. The moment a powerful person finally chose evidence over comfort. Rachel, the yacht's security chief, brought a tablet from the bridge office within minutes. Preston placed it on the table instead of holding it to himself. Grace noticed that. So did the crew. The footage showed the technical corridor at 7:09. A junior engineer slid a folder into the wall tray marked executive review. At 7:12, Derek's assistant entered, looked once toward the camera, removed the folder, and handed it to the event manager near the floral service alcove. No struggle. No chaos. Just a quiet deletion dressed as efficiency. Derek gave a controlled laugh. A copy was moved. That is all. Grace looked at the tablet. Truth often gets moved before it gets buried. The event manager covered her mouth. The junior engineer, standing near the stairwell, looked as if someone had finally said the thing he had been swallowing all night. Preston stared at the screen longer than anyone expected. Then he looked at Grace. Who else knew? She did not answer quickly. She turned toward the crew gathered in the shadows beyond the bar. 2 engineers, a steward, the junior deck officer, a dishwasher who had paused with a tray of glasses in his hands. "Ask them," she said. "They tried before I did." Preston followed her gaze, and shame moved across his face with the slow force of tidewater. He had built a world where people waited for permission to protect him. He had mistaken silence for loyalty. He had mistaken polish for competence. He had called the one person still listening just a waitress. "Bring them here," he said softly. Derek's expression tightened. "Preston, this is turning into a tribunal." Preston looked at the sealed contract folder, then at the wet floor, then at the crew members who had kept his yacht alive while his guests toasted above their warnings. "No," he said. "It is turning into the first honest meeting we have had tonight." The crew did not enter the upper deck like people stepping into a meeting. They entered like people stepping into weather, careful, braced, unsure which way the wind would turn. The junior engineer came first, a woman named Allison Reed with a tablet held tightly against her chest. Behind her stood Mark, the deck officer who had logged the first vibration warning, then Louise from the galley, who had seen the maintenance folder move through the service alcove, then two stewards who had heard the event manager say the report would make the night look unstable. Grace Miller remained near the bar, no longer in the center, but no longer invisible either. Preston Caldwell watched each person arrive and felt the structure of his world becoming visible in a way he did not like. These were not dramatic people, not troublemakers, not enemies of success. They were tired workers in black uniforms and deck shoes, carrying small truths that had been made to feel dangerous. Derek Vance stood near the contract table, jaw set, still trying to look like the only adult in a room losing discipline. "This is unnecessary," he said. "You are putting employees under pressure in front of investors." Grace looked at him. They were already under pressure. "You only object now because the pressure has witnesses." No one laughed. It was too accurate for laughter. Preston turned to Allison. "Tell me what you entered at 6:40. Allison's eyes flicked to Derek, then to the captain, then to Preston. Moisture at the port watertight threshold. Irregular compensation on the stabilizer readout. It was not an emergency, sir, but it was enough to delay offshore movement until inspection. Preston heard the care in her wording. Not exaggerated. Not emotional. Professional. Exactly the kind of voice his system should have carried to him. "And why did it not reach me?" Allison swallowed. "I sent it through the event packet. That is protocol during private functions." Mark, the deck officer, spoke next. "I also radioed the bridge, but the channel was busy with arrival coordination. I was told the concern had been logged." The event manager's face crumpled slightly. "I was told to keep anything that sounded expensive out of the investor deck until after signatures." Preston looked at Derek. Derek spread his hands. "That is negotiation discipline, not concealment." The captain's expression hardened. On a vessel, those can become the same thing. The words settled over the deck. Grace lowered her eyes for a moment, thinking of her father standing in his Newport repair shop, wiping his hands on a rag while a yacht owner in loafers called him dramatic for recommending a delay. 3 weeks later, the same owner returned with damage that cost 10 times more than the warning. He still never apologized. Men like that rarely hated the truth. They hated receiving it from the wrong social class. Preston looked at Grace as if he had sensed the memory moving through her. "Your father taught you this?" he asked. She nodded. "He taught me that boats do not care who owns them. They only respond to what is maintained." A simple sentence. A clean cut. Preston looked down at his untouched champagne, the closed contract, the wet mark on the teak, and finally at the employees waiting to learn whether honesty would cost them. "The signing is suspended," he said. Derek went still. "You are making a reckless decision." Preston turned toward him fully. "No. I made reckless decisions before Miss Miller asked for 10 seconds of silence." Derek's face flushed, but Preston was no longer speaking to him. He faced the crew. "Every warning log tonight will be reviewed directly with the captain. No one will be penalized for reporting it. No event manager, investor, or executive has authority to bury a safety concern on this vessel again." Allison's shoulders dropped as if she had been holding her breath for hours. Mark looked at the floor, blinking too quickly. Louise crossed himself quietly near the galley door. Grace saw all of it. The tiny releases. The human cost of finally being believed. Preston turned back to her, and the apology came before pride could dress it up. "I was wrong to call you just anything." Grace met his eyes. The deck lights reflected softly in her blue gaze. Then do not start by apologizing to me, she said. Start with the people who tried to warn you before I heard them whisper. Preston looked toward the crew again, and this time, he truly listened. Preston Caldwell did not move for a long moment after Grace spoke. The wind moved across the upper deck, carrying salt, silence, and the faint mechanical hum of a yacht being held in place because one person had asked for 10 seconds without music. The crew stood before him in a line that should never have been necessary. Allison with her maintenance tablet, Mark with his radio clipped at his belt, Luis near the galley door, two stewards with their hands folded in front of them, the captain watching everything with the tired patience of a man who understood the sea better than investors ever would. Preston looked at each of them, not as functions, not as uniforms, but as people who had tried to protect a vessel while being trained to soften the truth for comfort. Allison, he said. Her eyes lifted. You logged the warning. You did your job. I am sorry my system made your job harder than my pride. Allison swallowed, then nodded once. Preston turned to Mark. You radioed it in. You should have been heard the first time. Mark's hand tightened around the radio. Thank you, sir. Preston looked toward Luis. You saw the folder moved. Luis shifted under the attention. I was not sure it was my place to say. Preston's face changed at that. Quietly, painfully. That is my failure, he said. Not yours. Derek Vance gave a low, impatient breath from near the contract table, but no one turned toward him. His power had depended on the room believing that business was the highest form of urgency. Now the yacht itself had corrected him. The radio crackled again, and the engineer below deck confirmed the repair window. No offshore movement until the seal was replaced and the stabilizer system recalibrated. No emergency while holding position. No danger if they respected the warning. Grace heard the phrase and felt something inside her loosen. That was what her father had always tried to teach people. Trouble did not have to become disaster if someone listened early enough. Preston ordered the captain to return toward Newport Harbor at safe speed once cleared. Then he turned to Derek. The deal is over for tonight. Derek stepped forward, voice low and polished. You are humiliating yourself over a maintenance delay and a waitress with a good ear. Preston looked at Grace, then back at Derek. No, I humiliated myself when I needed a waitress to remind me that people without titles still tell the truth. The investors heard it. The crew heard it. Grace heard it too, but she did not smile. She knew apology was only the door, not the room beyond it. Derek's assistant gathered the unsigned folders with stiff hands, but Preston stopped him. Leave the maintenance report. The assistant froze. Preston reached out and took the folder himself. It was thinner than the contract, cheaper than the champagne, and more important than both. He opened it on the table, under the lights where everyone could see. The first page carried Allison's warning, time stamped at 6:40. Moisture, seal concern, stabilizer irregularity. Plain words, nearly buried by expensive timing. Preston read them aloud, not dramatically, carefully, as if giving the warning back its dignity. When he finished, the deck remained quiet. Grace looked toward the dark water beyond the rail. Somewhere beneath that polished surface, the hull answered the waves with small patient sounds. She wondered how many truths had been whispered under music before tonight. How many workers had carried them in their throats, waiting for someone powerful enough to listen or humble enough to ask. The captain cleared his throat. Sir, shall we move the guests inside? Preston nodded, then paused. No speeches. No excuses. Tell them we are returning because the crew found an issue, and the crew was right. Those last 4 words moved through the workers like warmth. The crew was right. For some people, being right had never been the problem. Being believed had. Grace stepped back then, ready to disappear into service because old habits do not vanish with one apology. Preston saw the motion. Miss Miller, he said. She stopped. Please stay for the review. Grace looked at the crew before she looked at him. Only if they speak first. Preston lowered his eyes, accepting the condition. They will. The music did not resume. The champagne was cleared. The contract remained unsigned. And as the silver meridian turned slowly toward Newport under a quieter sky, Preston Caldwell stood beside the waitress he had once dismissed and listened to the people who had been keeping his world afloat all along. The silver meridian moved toward Newport Harbor like a mansion learning to lower its voice. The speed was gentle, the wake small, the deck lights dimmed to a softer glow that no longer tried to compete with the stars. Inside the main salon, the party had become something quieter and more honest. Guests sat with untouched drinks. Investors checked their phones in silence. Crew members gathered near the long glass table where, an hour earlier, Preston Caldwell had planned to sign the largest expansion deal of his career. Now the contract folder sat closed at one end, while the maintenance report lay open in the center like the only guest that mattered. Grace Miller stood near the service entrance with her hands folded loosely in front of her black apron. She had refused the chair Preston first offered because Allison had still been standing. When Allison sat, Grace sat too. That small order of things did not escape Preston. He noticed how Grace kept moving attention away from herself and back toward the people whose warnings had been buried before hers became impossible to ignore. One by one, the crew spoke. Allison explained the readings without decoration. Mark described the radio traffic and the missed handoff. Luis admitted he had seen Derek's assistant remove the folder, but had convinced himself it was not his business. A steward named Jenna said the event manager had warned the service staff not to mention technical concerns near investors because tone matters tonight. Preston wrote that phrase down. Tone matters tonight. He looked at the words until they became something uglier. Tone had mattered more than truth. Atmosphere had mattered more than safety. A clean investor deck had mattered more than the people walking on the real one. Derek Vance sat across from him, no longer smiling, his tie loosened just enough to show the first crack in his polish. "This has become theatrical," Derek said. "You are letting staff grievances reshape a strategic decision." Preston looked at the crew, then at Grace. "No," he said. "I am letting facts reshape a careless one." Grace watched him carefully. She had seen powerful men perform humility when the room required it, then return to old habits before the coffee cooled. Preston was not saved by one good sentence. No one was. But he had stopped defending himself. That mattered. The captain placed the security tablet on the table and played the corridor footage again. Derek's assistant removed the report. The event manager accepted it. The time stamp glowed in the corner. 7:12, 12 minutes after a warning that should have reached the owner. Preston turned to Derek. "You knew?" Derek's mouth tightened. "I knew there was a minor issue that could be used against us." "Against us," Preston repeated softly. "Not against the people on board. Not against the vessel. Against a price." Derek leaned forward. "That is how business works." Grace spoke before Preston could. "No, that is how people teach themselves to stop hearing." The room stilled. Her voice had not risen. It did not need to. Preston looked at her, and this time the apology in his face was not only for the insult. It was for the culture that had made the insult feel natural. The yacht slowed as harbor lights appeared beyond the windows, small and steady along the shore. Grace saw them and thought of her father's repair shop near a narrow street in Newport, the old blue sign, the bell over the door, the way he would stop mid-sentence if a boat engine changed pitch outside. He had never called listening a gift. He called it responsibility. "My father lost customers for telling the truth too early," she said quietly. "They said he made problems sound expensive. But he always said the cheapest warning is the one you respect the first time." Preston lowered his pen. No one interrupted her. Not even Derek. He died with a shop full of invoices people paid late and apologies they never said out loud, Grace continued. "So, I learned not to wait for permission when something sounds wrong." The harbor lights grew brighter. Preston looked at the open maintenance report, then at the crew, then at Derek. "Effective immediately, every safety concern goes directly to the captain and to me, unfiltered. Any person on this vessel can stop an event for review. Any person." Derek gave a cold laugh. "Including waitresses?" Preston turned his head slowly. "Especially the ones everyone assumes are not listening." Grace did not smile, but her shoulders, which had carried years of being underestimated, settled almost imperceptibly. The yacht eased toward the harbor under a sky gone pale at the edge. No one clapped. Nothing needed applause. Some reversals are loud. The important ones simply change who is allowed to speak. Newport Harbor received the Silver Meridian without ceremony. The first light of morning was still thin, stretching silver across the water and softening the expensive lines of the yacht as it moved toward its berth. No cameras waited. No applause followed. The guests had stopped pretending the night could be repaired with a statement. Some stood near the windows with coffee and paper cups from the galley, looking smaller without music and champagne around them. The investors gathered their coats in quiet clusters. Derek Vance remained in the main salon, speaking softly into his phone, but the polished certainty had left his posture. His assistant stood near the door with the unsigned folders held against his chest, careful not to meet the eyes of the crew. Preston Caldwell stood at the head of the glass table, still in his ivory blazer, though it no longer looked like armor. It looked like fabric, wrinkled at the elbow, damp at one cuff. Human. Grace Miller watched from near the service station as the captain finished his final update. The seal would be replaced before the yacht moved again. The stabilizer system would be recalibrated. The maintenance log would be audited by an outside marine safety firm. Every report from the crew would be preserved. Preston nodded after each point and wrote it down himself. Not delegated. Not summarized by Derek. Written by his own hand. When the captain finished, Preston closed the notebook and looked across the table at Allison, Mark, Luis, Jenna, and the others. "You were right," he said. "I should have heard you before Miss Miller had to make the room quiet." Allison looked down at her hands. Mark exhaled slowly. Luis gave a small nod that carried more relief than pride. Grace turned her eyes toward the windows. The harbor was close now. Old brick buildings. Dock lines. A gull passing over the marina. She could almost see her father's shop in the morning light, though it had been sold years before. She remembered him unlocking the door before sunrise, turning on the radio, tapping the side of a hull with 2 fingers. "Listen first," he used to say. "Tools come after." The yacht bumped gently against the fenders. Crew moved to secure lines. The guests began to leave, their designer shoes stepping carefully onto the dock as if the night had left something on them. Derek approached Preston near the salon entrance. "You know this can still be managed," he said. "We can frame it as responsible leadership. A short delay, no lasting damage." Preston looked at him with a calmness that made Derek stop smiling. "There is lasting damage," he said. "You taught people to hide the truth in order to protect a number." Derek's eyes narrowed. "And she taught you that by carrying drinks." Grace did not turn around. She heard it. Everyone heard it. The old tone. The old smallness. Preston stepped between Derek and the service station, not dramatically, simply enough to change the line of sight. "Grace Miller taught me that the lowest paid person in the room may be the only one still listening without an agenda." Derek gave a short laugh, but it did not land anywhere. Preston continued, "Your agreement with Silver Meridian Holdings is terminated pending legal review. Your assistant will provide the original report chain before leaving the vessel." The words were calm. Final. Derek looked at the investors nearby, searching for rescue in the same room that had once obeyed him. No one moved. The captain opened the salon door to the dock. Morning air entered, clean and cold. Grace picked up a stack of unused linen napkins because her hands wanted work when emotions became too visible. Preston noticed and walked over, stopping at a respectful distance. "Miss Miller," he said. "Grace, if I may." She looked at him. "Grace is fine." He took a breath. "I want to compensate you properly." She knew he meant well. That made the answer gentler, not easier. "Then compensate the crew first," she said. "Not as a bonus for saving your night. As protection for the next time they tell the truth early." Preston accepted the correction without flinching. "I will." Grace studied him, searching for performance and finding, at least for that moment, a man stripped of it. "And take the word just out of your vocabulary when you are talking about people." His eyes lowered. "I already have." Outside, the dock lines tightened. The Silver Meridian came fully still. Grace untied her apron, folded it over her arm, and stepped toward the service exit. Preston did not stop her this time. He only said, "Your father would have been proud." Grace paused with one hand on the rail. The morning light touched the wine-red ribbon in her hair. "He would have asked whether you changed the system," she said. Then she walked down the gangway into Newport's quiet dawn, leaving Preston with the answer still unwritten in his hands. 3 months later, the Silver Meridian returned to the water under a different kind of light. Not the gold of a private party. Not the bright, flattering glow meant for investors and photographs. It was late afternoon, and the harbor lay quiet beneath a pale blue sky, with gulls moving over the marina and sunlight touching the repaired teak deck in long, clean lines. The yacht looked almost the same from a distance. White hull, polished railings, elegant windows. But inside, its language had changed. Technical doors carried clear labels. Safety logs were posted where crew could access them. A direct reporting line connected every department to the captain and to Preston Caldwell himself. Any staff member could pause an event for review. It was written, signed, and repeated at every briefing, not as decoration, but as policy. Preston stood near the port service access in his ivory blazer, listening while Allison explained the new inspection schedule to a group of crew members and trainees. He did not interrupt. He did not check his phone. When she finished, he asked one question, then waited for the full answer. That was new too. On the dock below, Grace Miller arrived with a small canvas bag over one shoulder, wearing a clean white blouse, black slacks, and the same wine-red ribbon tying back her brown hair. She had not returned for a job. She had returned because the captain had invited her to see the changes before the yacht reopened for its first public charity cruise. Preston saw her from the deck and walked down the gangway himself. No assistant. No announcement. "Grace," he said. "Thank you for coming." She looked past him at the vessel, then back at his face. "I came to see if it learned anything." Preston nodded toward the posted safety board near the entry. It did. Grace studied it carefully. Her eyes moved across the reporting policy, the inspection chain, the crew authority notice, the maintenance archive access. She did not praise quickly. That made the silence valuable. "Finally," she said, "this is better." Preston accepted the measured answer as if it were a gift. "Your father's question stayed with me." Grace looked toward the harbor. He would have asked another one by now. "What would it be?" Preston asked. A small smile touched her face. Not quite amusement, not quite sadness. Whether people are using the system when it costs something. Preston looked back at the yacht. They are. Last week, a steward paused a reception because a galley sensor sounded wrong. It was only a battery fault. We thanked him anyway. Grace nodded. Good. That is how trust learns to breathe. On the upper deck, the crew prepared tables without hurry. No jazz covered the sound of radios. No investor folders waited beside champagne. Derek Vance was gone, his partnership ended, his hidden report chain now part of a legal file. The event manager had been reassigned after training. Allison had been promoted to lead marine systems supervisor. Mark now opened every voyage briefing with one sentence. Anyone can stop the room if the vessel speaks. Preston and Grace stood at the railing as the sun lowered over Newport, turning the water copper. "I also removed a word," Preston said. Grace did not ask which one. He answered anyway. "Just." The wind moved lightly between them. Grace looked at the silver meridian, then at the crew, then at the quiet place in Preston's face where certainty used to live. "That word was never small," she said. "It only made people smaller." Preston lowered his eyes. "I know." The charity guests began to board, greeted by crew members whose names appeared clearly on their badges and in the welcome program. Not as background, as the people responsible for bringing everyone safely home. Grace watched a young server point out the safety board to a guest without fear. She thought of her father's old shop, the invoices paid late, the apologies never spoken, the way he had listened to boats as if listening were a form of respect. Maybe some apologies arrived after the person who deserved them. Maybe they still mattered if they changed what came next. As the yacht eased away from the dock, Preston did not stand above the crew giving orders. He stood beside them, hearing the radios, the engines, the water against the hull, and the quiet authority in voices he had once paid not to notice. Grace remained near the rail, her wine-red ribbon bright in the evening air. She was not announced as a hero. She did not need to be. The yacht had not hidden the truth. Powerful people had simply taught everyone to whisper it. And on that evening, for the first time, the whispers were allowed to become the standard.